The grand ballroom of Ashworth Manor sparkled under the light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. Prince Alexander Edward Ashworth stood at the edge of the marble dance floor, his piercing blue eyes scanning the crowd of nobility that had gathered for the annual royal gala. At 28, he was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in the Kingdom of Eldoria, yet tonight his mind was consumed by an impossible choice that would change everything. For months, the kingdom had been buzzing with anticipation about Alexander's impending engagement announcement. The royal council had made their preference clear. Lady Catherine Morningstar, the daughter of Duke Morningstar, was the perfect match. She was beautiful, intelligent, well-educated in diplomatic affairs, and came from one of the most powerful families in the realm. The political alliance would strengthen Eldoria's position against neighboring kingdoms and secure trade routes that had been contested for decades. Catherine moved through the ballroom with effortless grace, her emerald silk gown flowing like water around her slender figure. Her auburn hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, adorned with the Morningstar family diamonds that caught the light with every turn of her head. She commanded attention wherever she went, engaging in witty conversation with ambassadors and charming even the most stern-faced ministers with her knowledge of international affairs. But Alexander's attention kept drifting to a different figure across the room. Lady Camille Rosewood stood near the French doors that led to the gardens, looking somewhat out of place among the grandeur. She was the daughter of a minor lord from the countryside, invited more out of courtesy than expectation. Her simple blue dress was beautiful but modest compared to the elaborate gowns around her. Her dark blonde hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and, when she smiled, which she did often while talking to the palace staff, her entire face lit up with genuine warmth. Alexander had first met Camille 3 months ago when she had come to court to petition for aid for her father's struggling estate. While other nobles had dismissed her cause as unworthy of royal attention, Alexander had been struck by her passion for helping the common people who lived on her family's lands. She spoke of farmers who couldn't afford seed for the next season, of children who walked miles to attend a one-room schoolhouse, of elderly villagers who needed medical care that was beyond their reach. Their first conversation had lasted only 15 minutes, but it had awakened something in Alexander that he hadn't known was missing. While Catherine spoke of policy and politics with impressive expertise, Camille spoke of people, real individuals with names and faces and stories that mattered. She had a way of making the abstract concept of ruling a kingdom feel immediate and personal. In the weeks that followed, Alexander had found reasons to visit the Rosewood estate. He told himself it was to better understand the needs of rural Eldoria, but the truth was far more complicated. Every conversation with Camille revealed another layer of her character that fascinated him. She read voraciously, not just the classics that were expected of nobility, but also agricultural journals, medical texts, and philosophical works that challenged conventional thinking. During one memorable afternoon, they had sat by a stream that ran through the Rosewood property while Camille explained her dream of establishing a network of schools throughout the countryside. Her eyes had shone with such conviction as she described how education could break the cycle of poverty that trapped so many families. Alexander found himself not just listening, but genuinely excited about her vision for the future. The kingdom's strength doesn't come from its armies or its treasuries, she had said that day, her fingers trailing in the cool water. It comes from the potential of every person within its borders. When we invest in that potential, we invest in something that can never be conquered or stolen. Now, as Alexander watched her from across the ballroom, he could see that same passionate spirit even in this formal setting. She was deep in conversation with an elderly woman who served in the palace kitchens, listening intently, as if the woman's words were the most important thing in the world. This was who Camille was at her core, someone who saw value in every person, regardless of their station. Meanwhile, Catherine had noticed Alexander's distraction and was making her way toward him, her diplomatic smile firmly in place. She was everything a future queen should be, and Alexander couldn't deny her many admirable qualities. She was brilliant in negotiations, spoke 4 languages fluently, and had already proven herself capable of representing Eldoria at international gatherings. The marriage would be beneficial for the kingdom in countless ways. "Your Highness," Catherine said as she reached his side, offering a practiced curtsy. "You seem deep in thought this evening." "Indeed I am," Alexander replied, turning to face her fully. "I've been considering the weight of the decision before me." Catherine's green eyes sparkled with confidence. She believed, as did everyone else in the room, that the announcement of their engagement was merely a formality. The match had been discussed for years, their compatibility was obvious, and the political advantages were undeniable. What could there be to consider? The future of the kingdom is always worth careful consideration, she said diplomatically. Though I believe the path forward is quite clear. Alexander nodded slowly, but his gaze drifted once more to Camille, who was now helping an elderly gentleman to a chair, her natural kindness shining through the formal atmosphere. The contrast between the two women was striking, and it forced Alexander to confront a question he had been avoiding. What kind of king did he want to be, and what kind of partner would help him become that man? As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself at a crossroads that would define not only his personal happiness, but the very nature of his future reign. The choice between Catherine and Camille represented more than a decision between two remarkable women. It was a choice between two different visions of leadership, two different approaches to serving his people, and two different paths for the kingdom of Eldoria. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and both women looked in his direction, waiting to see whom he would ask to dance. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Alexander straightened his shoulders, knowing that his next move would set events in motion that could not be undone. The weight of crown and kingdom pressed down on him, but so did the weight of his own heart. As he stepped forward to make his choice, Alexander realized that tonight would be remembered as the moment everything changed, not just for him, but for everyone whose lives would be touched by the decision he was about to make. Alexander took a deep breath and walked directly toward Camille, his decision crystallizing with each step. The murmur of conversation around the ballroom gradually died down as guests noticed the direction of his movement. Catherine's confident smile faltered slightly, though she maintained her composure with the grace expected of her station. "Lady Rosewood," Alexander said as he approached Camille, offering his hand with a formal bow. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" Camille's eyes widened in surprise, and a soft blush colored her cheeks. She glanced around the room, suddenly aware that every eye was fixed upon them. "Your Highness, surely there are others more deserving of your attention." "There is no one in this room more deserving," Alexander replied, his voice carrying clearly in the now silent ballroom. "The honor would be entirely mine." With a graceful curtsy, Camille accepted his outstretched hand, and they moved together onto the dance floor. As the orchestra resumed the waltz, Alexander was acutely aware of the whispers that rippled through the crowd like waves. He could feel Catherine's piercing gaze from across the room, and he glimpsed his parents' shocked expressions from their position near the throne. As they danced, Alexander found himself lost in Camille's presence. Unlike the perfectly choreographed performances he was accustomed to with other ladies of the court, this felt natural and unforced. Camille's movements were graceful but unpretentious, and when she looked up at him, there was no calculation in her eyes, only genuine warmth and a hint of nervous excitement. "I fear I may have caused quite a stir," Camille whispered as they turned together, her voice barely audible above the music. "Perhaps that's exactly what this court needs," Alexander replied, spinning her gently. A reminder that tradition isn't always the same as wisdom. When the dance ended, Alexander didn't immediately release her hand. Instead, he led her toward the garden doors, away from the intense scrutiny of the ballroom. The cool evening air was a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere inside, and the sound of fountains provided a peaceful backdrop to their conversation. "Your Highness," Camille began, her voice uncertain, "I don't understand what's happening. Everyone expected you to dance with Lady Catherine tonight. They expected more." Alexander turned to face her fully, his expression serious but kind. "What they expected was for me to follow a path laid out by others, regardless of my own feelings or convictions. But tonight, I realized that kind of leadership isn't what Eldoria needs." Over the following days, Alexander's decision to publicly favor Camille over Catherine sent shockwaves through the royal court. Emergency council meetings were called, and heated discussions echoed through the palace corridors. Duke Morningstar demanded an audience with the king, his anger barely contained as he spoke of broken promises and damaged alliances. "This is not merely a personal slight," the Duke declared during a tense meeting in the king's private study. "The Morningstar family has been loyal to the crown for generations. Lady Catherine has been groomed for this role since childhood. To cast her aside for a country girl with no political connections is not just unwise, it's dangerous." King Edward rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of his years more acutely than ever before. Alexander is my heir and will be king. He must have some say in choosing his queen. A king's marriage is never just personal, Queen Isabella interjected, her voice tight with concern. The stability of the realm depends on strategic alliances. What message does this send to our allies? To our enemies? Meanwhile, in a different wing of the palace, Catherine was having her own crisis of faith. She sat in her elegantly appointed guest chamber, staring at her reflection in an ornate mirror while her lady-in-waiting brushed her hair. For 24 years, her entire life had been preparation for becoming queen. She had studied languages, diplomacy, and statecraft. She had attended every important social function, cultivated relationships with influential families, and modeled herself on the great queens of history. Perhaps there's still time to change his mind, her lady-in-waiting suggested gently. Men are often swayed by momentary infatuations. His Highness will surely come to his senses when he considers the practical implications. But Catherine shook her head slowly. She had seen the way Alexander looked at Camille during their dance, and she recognized something that all her education and preparation couldn't compete with: genuine love. The realization was both devastating and strangely liberating. For the first time in her life, she began to question whether the role she had been preparing for was truly what she wanted, or simply what had been expected of her. Far from the palace, in her modest family estate, Camille was experiencing her own upheaval. Word of the prince's attention had reached even the remote countryside, and suddenly, her quiet life was turned upside down. Royal messengers arrived daily with invitations to court functions, gifts from unknown admirers, and letters from distant relatives who had never shown interest in her welfare before. Her father, Lord Thomas Rosewood, was beside himself with anxiety and excitement. The family's financial troubles could be solved overnight if Camille truly captured the prince's heart, but he worried about the pressures and dangers that came with royal favor. "Are you certain this is what you want, my dear?" he asked one evening as they sat in their small library, the weight of recent events heavy between them. The court can be a treacherous place for those not born to it. And if the prince's feelings prove fleeting? Camille set down the book she had been reading, a collection of poetry that Alexander had sent her, and considered her father's words carefully. "I don't know if it's what I want, Papa. Everything is happening so quickly. But I do know that when I'm with Prince Alexander, I feel like I can be myself completely. We talk about ideas that matter, about making life better for ordinary people. If there's a chance to influence positive change in the kingdom, shouldn't I take it?" Back at the palace, Alexander was fighting battles on multiple fronts. His parents pressured him daily to reconsider his position, while the royal council presented increasingly dire predictions about the consequences of rejecting the Morningstar alliance. Foreign ambassadors began asking pointed questions about Eldoria's commitment to existing treaties, and rumors spread about potential military threats from neighboring kingdoms who saw the situation as a sign of weakness. Despite the pressure, Alexander found himself more certain of his feelings with each passing day. He had begun visiting Camille's estate regularly, sometimes spending entire afternoons walking through the villages on her family's land. He listened to tenant farmers discuss their challenges, visited the small school that Camille had helped establish, and observed firsthand the impact that thoughtful, compassionate leadership could have on ordinary lives. During one such visit, they encountered an elderly woman whose cottage had been damaged in a recent storm. Without hesitation, Camille had rolled up her sleeves and begun helping to repair the roof, recruiting several young men from the village to assist. Alexander had watched in amazement as she organized the repair work, while simultaneously comforting the woman's frightened grandchildren and ensuring that food was prepared for everyone who had come to help. "This is what queenship looks like," he had thought to himself as he joined the repair efforts, ignoring the protests of his guards about the propriety of a prince engaging in manual labor. Not ceremonies and protocols, but genuine service to people who need help. That evening, as they sat by the repaired cottage sharing a simple meal with the grateful family, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box, his heart pounding as he prepared to take the step that would make his choice irrevocable. The setting was far from the grand proposal that protocol demanded. There was no audience of nobles, no formal ceremony, no display of royal pageantry. But as Alexander looked at Camille in the golden light of the setting sun, her face glowing with the satisfaction of a day spent in meaningful service, he knew that this moment was more perfect than any elaborate court function could ever be. The future of the kingdom hung in the balance, and Alexander was about to make the choice that would define not only his own destiny but the destiny of every person under his future rule. Alexander knelt beside Camille in the cottage garden, the velvet box trembling slightly in his hands. The elderly woman they had helped earlier that day watched from her doorway with tears in her eyes, understanding the significance of what was unfolding before her. "Camille," Alexander began, his voice thick with emotion, "these past months have shown me what it truly means to serve our people. You've taught me that a crown's worth isn't measured in gold or jewels, but in the lives it touches and the hope it brings to those who need it most." Camille's breath caught as he opened the box, revealing not an ostentatious royal ring, but a simple band set with a single sapphire that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman known throughout the kingdom for her compassion and dedication to charitable works. "Will you marry me, not because it's expected or politically advantageous, but because together we can build something better for Eldoria?" Through tears, Camille whispered her acceptance, and as Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, the small group of villagers who had gathered broke into spontaneous celebration. Children ran through the streets spreading the news, and by nightfall, bonfires had been lit in village squares throughout the countryside as common folk celebrated the prince's choice to marry one of their own. The reaction at the royal palace was decidedly less celebratory. When news of the engagement reached the court, King Edward called an emergency session with his closest advisors. The great council chamber had never felt more oppressive as voices rose in heated debate. "This is a catastrophe," Duke Morningstar declared, his face red with fury. "My daughter has been publicly humiliated, and the political ramifications will be severe. The Kingdom of Valeria was counting on this alliance to finalize our trade agreements. Without it, they may align themselves with our enemies instead." Lord Chancellor Morrison, an elderly man who had served the crown for 4 decades, shook his head gravely. "Your Majesty, I fear the prince has been blinded by infatuation. Lady Rosewood is a fine young woman, but she lacks the training, the connections, and the political acumen necessary for queenship. The court will never fully accept her." But not everyone in the chamber shared these concerns. Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, the kingdom's military commander, stood to address the assembly. "With respect to my colleagues, I believe we're focusing on the wrong questions. I've observed Prince Alexander closely these past months, and I've never seen him more engaged with the actual business of governing. His visits to the rural estates have given him insights into problems we've ignored for years." Queen Isabella, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "What troubles me most is not the political implications, but Alexander's happiness. I've watched him fulfill every duty expected of him since childhood, but I've rarely seen him truly content. When he speaks of Lady Rosewood, there's a light in his eyes that's been absent for years." The debate continued through the night, but ultimately, the king made his decision. "Alexander is my son and my heir. If he believes Lady Rosewood is the right choice, then we must trust his judgment and do everything possible to ensure their success." Meanwhile, Catherine was dealing with her own crisis. The public rejection had been devastating, not just personally, but for her family's reputation. However, as the initial shock wore off, she began to feel an unexpected sense of relief. For the first time in her life, she was free to consider what she actually wanted, rather than what was expected of her. She requested a private audience with Alexander, which took place in the palace's rose garden on a crisp autumn morning. Both approached the meeting with apprehension, knowing that their conversation would determine whether they could maintain any semblance of friendship despite the circumstances. "I won't pretend that your choice didn't hurt," Catherine began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "But I've had time to reflect, and I realize that you've given me an unexpected gift." Alexander looked at her with surprise and concern. "Catherine, I never intended to cause you pain. Your qualities as a potential queen are undeniable, and any man would be fortunate." "Please," she interrupted gently. "Let me finish. You freed me from a future that I now realize was chosen for me rather than by me. I've spent my entire life becoming someone else's vision of what I should be. Perhaps now I can discover who I truly am and what I actually want from life." Their conversation revealed the depth of Catherine's intelligence and grace. Rather than nursing wounded pride or plotting revenge, she chose to embrace the opportunity for self-discovery. She announced her intention to travel to the Kingdom of Astoria, where she would serve as Eldoria's cultural ambassador, a role that would utilize her diplomatic skills while allowing her the independence she had never experienced. As weeks passed, Camille began the challenging process of preparing for her future role. The transition was not easy. Court etiquette that came naturally to those raised in noble households had to be learned from scratch. Languages that Catherine spoke fluently required intensive study. The complex web of political relationships and historical grievances between noble families was like learning a new form of navigation. Lady Margaret Sinclair, the Queen's most trusted advisor, was assigned to guide Camille through this transformation. Initially skeptical of the future Queen's prospects, Lady Margaret was gradually won over by Camille's determination and quick mind. "Your pronunciation of the Valerian dialect is improving," Lady Margaret noted during one of their daily lessons. "But remember, when addressing the Duchess of Westmere, you must never mention trade routes through the eastern passes." Her family lost significant revenues when those routes were redirected 50 years ago. Camille absorbed every detail, but she also brought her own perspective to her education. During a lesson on court ceremonies, she suggested modifications that would make certain functions more accessible to common citizens. When studying economic policy, she proposed initiatives to improve rural education and healthcare. Her ideas were often met with resistance from traditional courtiers, but Alexander championed her suggestions whenever possible. The biggest test came when neighboring kingdoms sent delegations to assess Eldoria's new future queen. The Kingdom of Valeria, already displeased by the broken engagement with Catherine, sent Ambassador Lord Victor Reeves, known for his sharp tongue and political ruthlessness. The formal reception was held in the palace's grand throne room, with representatives from 6 kingdoms in attendance. Camille, wearing a gown designed to project both elegance and approachability, stood beside Alexander as they welcomed each delegation. Her nerves were evident to those who knew her well, but, to the visiting diplomats, she appeared composed and confident. Ambassador Reeves wasted no time in testing her resolve. During the formal dinner that followed, he posed a series of increasingly difficult questions about trade policy, military alliances, and historical disputes. Camille answered each query thoughtfully, drawing on her intensive study but also bringing her unique perspective to complex issues. "Tell me, Your Highness," the ambassador said, using her title with barely concealed irony, "what qualifies you to represent Eldoria's interests in matters of international importance? Your background is rather provincial." The room fell silent, and Alexander tensed beside her. But Camille remained calm, meeting the ambassador's gaze directly. "You're quite right that my background is different from what you might expect. I've spent time in farming communities, rural schools, and village workshops. This experience has taught me that international policies ultimately affect individual people, farmers who depend on fair trade agreements, families who benefit from peaceful borders, and communities that prosper when kingdoms cooperate rather than compete." She paused, allowing her words to resonate before continuing. "Perhaps what qualifies me is not my pedigree, but my understanding that diplomacy serves its highest purpose when it improves the lives of ordinary citizens in all our kingdoms." Ambassador Reeves was visibly taken aback by her response, and murmurs of approval rippled through the assembled guests. Even delegates who had arrived skeptical of Camille's suitability found themselves impressed by her sincerity and substance. As the evening progressed, it became clear that Camille's unconventional background was becoming one of her greatest assets. Foreign representatives who were accustomed to dealing with privileged nobles found her perspective refreshing and her commitment to practical governance appealing. But the greatest challenge was yet to come. News arrived that the neighboring kingdom of Drakmor, long Eldoria's most aggressive rival, was mobilizing troops along the border. King Aldric of Drakmor had apparently decided that Eldoria's internal changes represented an opportunity to press long-standing territorial claims. The crisis would test not only Alexander's leadership, but also whether his choice of bride had strengthened or weakened Eldoria's position on the world stage. As war clouds gathered on the horizon, the kingdom held its breath to see how their future king and queen would respond to their first major test. The war drums of Drakmor echoed across the valley as King Aldric's forces assembled along Eldoria's eastern border. In the royal war room, maps covered every surface, and urgent discussions continued through the night as Alexander and his military advisors developed defensive strategies. "They have superior numbers," Sir Geoffrey reported grimly, pointing to the latest intelligence reports. 20,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and their siege engines are among the finest in the known kingdoms. "King Aldric believes our recent changes in leadership have left us vulnerable." Alexander studied the tactical positions, his jaw set with determination. What does he hope to gain? The eastern provinces have been disputed territory for generations, but never has he moved so boldly. Intelligence suggests he sees an opportunity, Lord Chancellor Morrison interjected. Our potential allies are uncertain about our new direction. The Morning Star Alliance would have guaranteed support from 3 neighboring kingdoms. Without it, the implication hung heavy in the air. Alexander's choice of Camille over Catherine had indeed created political uncertainty that Drakmor was eager to exploit. But before anyone could voice these concerns directly, Camille herself entered the war room, carrying a leather portfolio filled with documents. Your Highness, Sir Geoffrey began, clearly uncomfortable with her presence in what was traditionally a male domain. These discussions involve sensitive military matters. Which is precisely why I need to be here, Camille replied firmly, setting her materials on the central table. I've spent the past 3 days studying everything I could find about Drakmor's previous conflicts, their economic situation, and their internal politics. I believe there may be alternatives to prolonged warfare. Alexander gestured for her to continue. Despite the skeptical expressions around the table, Camille unfolded a detailed map showing trade routes, resource distributions, and population centers. King Aldrich's aggression isn't just about territory, she began, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. Drakmor has suffered 3 consecutive years of poor harvests. Their eastern provinces are experiencing food shortages, and their treasury is nearly depleted from maintaining such a large standing army. This military campaign is as much about desperation as ambition. She pointed to several marked locations on the map. These villages along their border have family connections to communities in our eastern provinces. Many of them would rather see peaceful coexistence than destructive warfare. If we could establish direct communication with Drakmor's people, rather than just their king, we might find unexpected allies. Lord Chancellor Morrison frowned deeply. Your Highness, diplomacy with enemy populations during military mobilization is unprecedented and potentially treasonous by their laws. But not by ours, Alexander said thoughtfully, studying Camille's analysis. What exactly are you proposing? Camille's eyes lit up with the same passion Alexander had first noticed months ago. A humanitarian mission. We send supplies, food, medical aid, agricultural tools, directly to the suffering communities in Drakmor's eastern provinces. Not as a political gesture, but as assistance from one people to another in times of need. The room erupted in protests. Sir Geoffrey was the most vocal. Your Highness, this is military madness. We would be supplying potential enemies while they threaten our borders. But, Camille pressed on, consider the strategic implications. King Aldrich's power depends on convincing his people that Eldoria is their enemy, that conquest is their only path to prosperity. What happens to that narrative if Eldorian aid saves their children from hunger? What happens to his support if his own people begin questioning the necessity of war? Alexander studied the map more carefully, beginning to see the brilliance of Camille's unconventional approach. It's audacious, he admitted, and incredibly risky. If it fails, we'll have wasted resources we need for defense while giving Drakmor intelligence about our supply capabilities. But if it succeeds, Camille continued, we might achieve peace without a single battle. And even if war becomes inevitable, we'll have demonstrated to the world that Eldoria seeks peaceful solutions first. That moral authority could be crucial in securing support from uncommitted kingdoms. The debate continued for hours, but eventually, Alexander made his decision. Against the advice of most military counselors, he authorized Camille's humanitarian mission. Wagon trains loaded with grain, medical supplies, and farming equipment would cross the border under flags of mercy, not war. The mission's leader was Sir Thomas Brightwater, a respected knight known for his diplomatic skills and unwavering integrity. He was given explicit instructions to avoid any actions that could be construed as espionage, while documenting the reception of Eldorian aid among Drakmor's civilian population. Meanwhile, defensive preparations continued in earnest. Alexander personally visited border fortifications, inspiring troops with his presence while ensuring adequate supplies and reinforcements. But the real test of leadership came when refugees from Drakmor's eastern provinces began arriving at Eldoria's border, seeking sanctuary from both hunger and the approaching conflict. Traditional military doctrine would have turned these refugees away as potential spies or burdens on already strained resources. Instead, Camille proposed establishing refugee camps with proper food, shelter, and medical care. More controversially, she suggested allowing the refugees to send messages back to their families in Drakmor, describing the treatment they received in Eldoria. Every refugee who returns home with stories of Eldorian compassion becomes an advocate for peace, she argued during another late-night council session. King Aldric's justifications for war become harder to maintain when his own people have experienced our generosity firsthand. Alexander supported her proposal despite intense opposition from military traditionalists. Refugee camps were established with exemplary conditions, and refugees were indeed encouraged to maintain contact with their families across the border. The cost was significant, but the investment was about to pay unexpected dividends. Within 2 weeks, reports began arriving from Sir Thomas's humanitarian mission. The reception of Eldorian aid in Drakmor's eastern provinces had been overwhelmingly positive. Grateful villagers spoke openly about their appreciation for Eldorian generosity, and word spread rapidly throughout the region. More significantly, several local Drakmor officials had privately expressed their reluctance to attack a kingdom that had shown such compassion to their people. But the most dramatic development came from an unexpected source. Princess Elena of Drakmor, King Aldric's youngest daughter, sent a secret message requesting a private meeting with Camille. Elena had been moved by reports of the humanitarian aid and refugee care, and she believed there might be a path to peace that her father's pride would never allow him to pursue directly. The meeting was arranged in secret at a neutral monastery located in the disputed borderlands. Camille, accompanied only by Sir Thomas and a small security detail, met Princess Elena in the monastery's ancient library, surrounded by centuries-old manuscripts that had witnessed countless conflicts and peace negotiations. Princess Elena was younger than Camille, perhaps 22 years old, with the bearing of someone who had grown up in the shadow of military conflict. Her father's aggressive policies had made her kingdom increasingly isolated, and she had watched with growing concern as resources were diverted from education and infrastructure to support endless military preparations. Your humanitarian mission has caused quite a stir in our court, Elena began carefully, clearly nervous about the consequences of this secret meeting. My father is furious, but many of our provincial governors are asking difficult questions about why we're preparing to attack people who send food to our hungry children. Camille listened intently as Elena described the internal tensions within Drakmor's leadership. The kingdom was more fragmented than it appeared from the outside, with significant opposition to King Aldric's aggressive policies. The humanitarian aid had given voice to those who favored peaceful coexistence, creating political pressure that the king could not entirely ignore. What would it take to avoid this war? Camille asked directly. Elena hesitated, then spoke with remarkable candor. My father needs a way to withdraw his forces without appearing weak. He's committed publicly to reclaiming the eastern provinces, and his military commanders expect action. But if there were a larger diplomatic framework, perhaps involving multiple kingdoms, that addressed both territorial disputes and economic cooperation. The conversation continued for hours, laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most innovative peace negotiations in the region's history. But, as they spoke, neither woman realized that King Aldric's spies had discovered their meeting. The consequences of this revelation would test everything Alexander and Camille had worked to build, and determine whether their unconventional approach to leadership could survive its greatest challenge yet. King Aldric's fury knew no bounds when he learned of his daughter's secret meeting with Camille. In the great hall of Drakmor's fortress castle, his roar of rage echoed off stone walls that had witnessed centuries of royal anger, but perhaps never quite like this. Treason, he bellowed, his weathered face purple with indignation. My own daughter consorting with the enemy while our armies prepare for battle. She has betrayed not only her crown but her blood. Princess Elena stood before her father's throne with remarkable composure despite the gravity of her situation. She had known the risks when she arranged the meeting, but the possibility of preventing a devastating war had seemed worth any personal consequences. Father, I acted out of love for our kingdom, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. The people of our eastern provinces are grateful for Eldorian aid. They question the wisdom of attacking those who have shown them kindness. Perhaps we should question it as well. The king's closest advisor, Lord Marshal Victor Grimm, stepped forward with barely concealed satisfaction. He had opposed Elena's progressive ideas for years and saw this moment as an opportunity to eliminate her influence permanently. Your Majesty, the princess has committed an act of high treason that demands severe punishment, he declared. Her actions have compromised military security and undermined royal authority. The penalty for such crimes is clear under our ancient laws. But Elena had not acted without consideration for the consequences. During her secret meeting with Camille, she had shared information about internal divisions within Drakmore's court. But she had also received something valuable in return, a comprehensive proposal for regional peace that addressed many of Drakmore's underlying economic problems. "Before you pass judgment," Elena said, producing a sealed document from her robes, "I ask you to consider what I learned during my meeting. Eldoria proposes a continental peace conference involving all neighboring kingdoms, with specific provisions for trade agreements, resource sharing, and territorial adjustments that could benefit everyone." King Aldrich snatched the document and read it with growing surprise. The proposal was far more sophisticated than anything his advisors had expected from what they dismissed as an inexperienced future queen. It offered genuine solutions to problems that had plagued the region for decades. Meanwhile, in Eldoria's capital, Alexander and Camille anxiously awaited word from the secret meeting. They had gambled everything on the possibility that Princess Elena could influence her father's thinking, but they also knew that discovery of the meeting could trigger immediate war rather than prevent it. The answer came at dawn 3 days later, when a lone rider approached Eldoria's main gate under a flag of truce. The messenger carried not a declaration of war, as many expected, but an invitation to the very peace conference that Elena had proposed. King Aldrich, despite his fury at his daughter's actions, had been forced to acknowledge the political wisdom of her initiative. The Continental Peace Conference convened 6 weeks later in the neutral city of Meridian, located at the crossroads between 5 kingdoms. Representatives from across the known world gathered in the ancient Assembly Hall, a magnificent structure built specifically for diplomatic negotiations centuries earlier. Alexander and Camille arrived with a carefully chosen delegation that included both traditional diplomats and unconventional advisors who brought practical experience in agriculture, trade, and regional governance. Camille had insisted that the voices of common citizens be represented in discussions that would ultimately affect their daily lives. The opening ceremonies were formal and filled with the pageantry expected of such gatherings, but the real work began in smaller committee meetings where specific issues could be addressed with the detail they required. Camille found herself leading discussions on humanitarian cooperation, drawing on her experience with the refugee crisis and aid missions that had helped defuse the immediate military threat. King Aldrich attended the conference himself, bringing Princess Elena despite the continuing tension between them. The Drakmore delegation was visibly divided, with traditional military advisors pushing for aggressive territorial demands while Elena and a growing faction of younger nobles advocated for the economic cooperation that had been proposed. The most dramatic moment came during the 3rd day of negotiations, when Catherine unexpectedly arrived as part of the Astrian delegation. Her service as cultural ambassador had given her valuable insights into the concerns of smaller kingdoms that often felt overshadowed by larger powers. "Your Majesties," Catherine addressed the full assembly, "I come representing kingdoms that have too often been forced to choose sides in conflicts not of their making. We propose a different approach, regional alliances based on mutual benefit rather than military necessity." Her presence created an extraordinary dynamic in the negotiations. 3 remarkable women who had been connected by the marriage controversy now found themselves working together to reshape the political landscape of their entire region. Catherine's diplomatic expertise, Elena's knowledge of Drakmore's internal politics, and Camille's focus on practical governance created a powerful combination that surprised even seasoned negotiators. The breakthrough came when Camille proposed the establishment of a regional cooperation council with rotating leadership among the participating kingdoms. This body would coordinate responses to natural disasters, facilitate trade disputes, and provide a forum for addressing grievances before they escalated to military conflicts. Wars often begin with misunderstandings that grow into grievances that harden into hatred, she told the assembly. But if we create mechanisms for regular communication and cooperation, we can address problems while they're still manageable. King Aldrich initially resisted the proposal, viewing it as a limitation on sovereign authority. But when Princess Elena pointed out that Drakmore would have equal voice with larger kingdoms in the council's deliberations, and that the economic benefits could address many of their internal problems, he began to reconsider. The final negotiations continued for another week, with complex discussions about trade routes, resource-sharing agreements, and territorial adjustments that would satisfy competing claims without requiring military enforcement. The humanitarian aid program that had begun as Camille's emergency response to potential war became the model for ongoing cooperation between kingdoms. When the treaties were finally signed, they represented more than just the end of a military crisis. The accords established new principles for international relations based on mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. The Regional Cooperation Council would become a permanent institution, with its first headquarters established in Meridian, and its rotating leadership beginning with a joint council, including representatives from all participating kingdoms. Alexander and Camille returned to Eldoria as heroes, but, more importantly, as leaders who had proven that unconventional approaches to governance could achieve results that traditional diplomacy had failed to accomplish. The marriage that had begun as a shocking rejection of political expectations had evolved into a partnership that was reshaping the political landscape of their entire world. Their wedding took place 6 months later in a ceremony that perfectly symbolized their approach to leadership. The main celebration was held in Eldoria's great cathedral with all the pageantry expected of a royal wedding. But parallel celebrations were held simultaneously in village squares throughout the kingdom, where common citizens could participate in the festivities as equals rather than spectators. Foreign dignitaries who attended the wedding remarked that they had never seen such genuine enthusiasm from a kingdom's population for their ruler's marriage. The partnership between Alexander and Camille had become a symbol of possibility, proof that leadership rooted in compassion and practical service could achieve more than power based solely on tradition and military strength. Princess Elena of Drakmore attended the wedding as an honored guest, her relationship with her father slowly healing as the benefits of the peace accords became apparent to all their people. Catherine sent warm congratulations from Astoria, where her diplomatic career was flourishing and where she had found personal happiness with a scholarly duke who appreciated her intellect and independence. As Alexander and Camille stood together during their wedding ceremony, looking out at the assembled crowd that included everyone from foreign royalty to local farmers, they knew that their stunning decision months earlier had been vindicated in ways they never could have imagined. Their choice to prioritize genuine partnership over political convenience had not only brought them personal happiness, but had helped create a more peaceful and cooperative world for everyone they served. The choice that had left everyone speechless had ultimately given everyone something to celebrate. A future built on hope rather than fear, cooperation rather than conflict, and the revolutionary idea that the best leaders are those who serve their people's highest aspirations rather than their lowest fears.